Professor Kael-Vex adjusted his 3 optical sensors with what could only be described as academic smugness. The ancient Thraxian had spent the last 4 centuries perfecting the art of intellectual humiliation, and today's lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy from students representing 17 different species across the Galactic Consortium. "Welcome, students, to Advanced Theoretical Physics," Kael-Vex announced, his voice carrying that particular tone professors used when they were about to crush dreams. "Today, we will attempt something that has stumped the finest minds in the galaxy for over 6,000 years." The lecture hall fell silent. Even the usually chatty Zephyrians stopped their telepathic gossip. "The infinite probability matrix," he continued, gesturing toward a holographic display that materialized above the podium. The display showed an impossibly complex, 3-dimensional maze of equations, symbols, and mathematical relationships that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. This problem has defeated Nobel laureates, destroyed academic careers, and driven several notable mathematicians to take up interpretive dance instead. A nervous chuckle rippled through the audience. Well, it would have been a chuckle if half the species present were capable of producing that particular sound. The Blorvians made a sort of wet, squelching noise instead. Kael-Vex's optical sensors focused on the back corner of the lecture hall, where a lone human sat quietly taking notes. The human appeared remarkably unremarkable, which was saying something considering humans were already considered one of the more boring species in the consortium. This particular specimen had brown hair, brown eyes, and wore the standard-issue student uniform with all the fashion sense of a maintenance droid. "Ah, yes," Kael-Vex said, his tone dripping with what humans might recognize as condescension. "I see we have a representative of Terra among us today. How quaint." The human looked up from his notes and smiled politely. "Actually, Professor, my name is Marcus Webb. I transferred here from Earth University last semester." "Indeed," Kael-Vex replied, somehow managing to make the word sound like an insult. "Well, Mr. Webb, perhaps you would like to take the first attempt at solving our little puzzle. I'm sure your species' renowned optimism will serve you well." The other students began that universal student behavior of suddenly finding their desks incredibly fascinating. Nobody wanted to be called on for something this impossible. The infinite probability matrix had been the theoretical physics equivalent of asking someone to count to infinity while juggling flaming plasma cores. Marcus shrugged and stood up. "Sure, why not?" The casual response sent a wave of secondary embarrassment through the lecture hall. Even the professor's optical sensors seemed to dilate in surprise. This was not the appropriate level of academic terror for the situation. "I beg your pardon?" Kael-Vex asked. "I said sure," Marcus repeated, walking down toward the podium. "Looks interesting. Looks interesting. The infinite probability matrix. The mathematical equivalent of trying to solve the meaning of existence while blindfolded and on fire." "Looks interesting." Professor Kael-Vex felt something that might have been amusement if his species were capable of such primitive emotions. Instead, it was more like academic satisfaction mixed with anticipation of impending intellectual carnage. "Very well," he said, stepping aside. "The floor is yours, Mr. Webb. Perhaps you could begin by explaining your approach to the class?" Marcus examined the holographic display for approximately 15 seconds. 15 seconds. Students from the Mega Brain Collective of Nirox Prime had spent entire semesters just trying to understand the basic framework of the problem. The record for staring at it in confused silence was held by a Vulcarian who had managed 4 hours before quietly having a nervous breakdown. "Right," Marcus said, cracking his knuckles in a way that made several non-human students flinch. "So this is basically asking us to calculate the probability of any given outcome in an infinite set of variables, accounting for quantum uncertainty, temporal fluctuations, and multidimensional interference patterns." The class exchanged glances. That was actually a reasonably accurate summary of the problem, which was concerning, because most students needed 3 months just to understand what the question was asking. The traditional approach, Marcus continued, would be to try to map each variable individually and then attempt to create a unified solution. But that's impossible because you'd need infinite computational power and infinite time. Professor Kael-Vex's optical sensors narrowed. The human was correct, but this was exactly why the problem was considered unsolvable. Where was this going? So instead, Marcus said, manipulating the holographic display with surprising dexterity, "You flip it." He flipped it. With a gesture that looked more like he was swatting at a particularly annoying fly, Marcus somehow inverted the entire mathematical framework. The equations rearranged themselves. The probability matrices shifted into new configurations, and suddenly the incomprehensible mess of mathematical theory began to make sense. If you can't calculate infinite probability, Marcus explained to a lecture hall full of beings whose brains were apparently short-circuiting, you calculate the probability of infinity instead. Then you just inverse the result and multiply by the temporal constant. The silence in the room was so complete, it had achieved its own gravitational field. The answer is 7.23, by the way, Marcus added helpfully. Plus or minus 0.0001, depending on whether you account for the background quantum fluctuations of the local galactic cluster. Professor Kael-Vex stared at the display. The equations were correct. Not just correct, but elegant, beautiful even. The solution that had eluded the greatest minds in galactic history had just been solved by a human who looked like he was trying to remember if he'd left his hoverbike illegally parked. "That's," the professor began, then stopped. His species didn't have a word for what this was. "Is that right?" Marcus asked, looking genuinely concerned. "I can double-check the math if you want. Sometimes I forget to carry the one. Forget to carry the one." On a mathematical proof that involved 16 dimensions and theoretical frameworks that most beings couldn't even pronounce. A student in the third row, a Centaurian with particularly impressive tentacles, raised one of them hesitantly. "Excuse me, but how did you know to flip it?" Marcus turned to look at the student, and his expression was one of genuine confusion. "Well, it was backwards, wasn't it? I mean, obviously you can't solve for infinite variables, so you solve for the infinity of the variables instead. It's like..." He paused, searching for an analogy. "It's like trying to count all the trees in a forest. You can't count infinite trees, but you can count the forest, and then you know how many tree forests you have." The explanation made absolutely no sense to anyone except Marcus, but somehow the mathematics supported his reasoning perfectly. "Tree forests," repeated a Blorvian student, making that wet squelching sound that indicated deep thought. "Yeah, tree forests," Marcus confirmed, as if this were the most natural thing in the galaxy. "Anyway, the key insight is that infinity isn't really infinite if you approach it from the right angle. It's more like really, really big. And really, really big is just a number that's tired of counting." Professor Kael-Vex felt something that his species had no word for, but humans might have recognized as an existential crisis. In the span of 10 minutes, this unremarkable human had casually solved a problem that had defined impossibility for millennia, explained it using an analogy involving tired numbers, and had somehow made it sound like basic common sense. "Mr. Webb," he said carefully, "what exactly did you study at Earth University?" "Oh, I was a literature major," Marcus replied cheerfully. "Minor in philosophy. This is just a hobby, really. A hobby. The infinite probability matrix. Literature major. Tree forests." The professor's optical sensors began to twitch in a way that indicated severe academic distress. "I see," he managed. "And tell me, as a literature major, how did you develop such an intuitive grasp of advanced theoretical physics?" Marcus shrugged. "Books are just information arranged in patterns, right? Math is just information arranged in different patterns. Once you understand that patterns are just patterns, it's all pretty much the same thing. Like Shakespeare's sonnets follow the same basic, structural principles as quantum mechanics, Both are trying to describe the fundamental nature of existence, they just use different symbols. The lecture hall had become so quiet that several students were beginning to wonder if they had accidentally died, and this was some sort of purgatory designed specifically for physics majors. Shakespeare and quantum mechanics? The professor repeated slowly. Sure. To be or not to be is basically the same question as Schrödinger's cat, isn't it? Both are dealing with the probability states of existence. Hamlet's just more dramatic about it. A student near the front made a sound that might have been laughter, hysteria, or a small mechanical failure. It was difficult to tell with robotic American students. Professor Kael-Vex realized that he was experiencing something his species had also never properly named, but which humans would recognize as the peculiar mixture of frustration, admiration, and incredulous disbelief that comes from watching someone casually accomplish the impossible while making it look like they were tying their shoes. Well, he said finally, I suppose that concludes today's lesson on the infinite probability matrix. Actually, Marcus said, looking at the holographic display again, there's a much simpler way to solve this whole thing. You don't really need all this math at all. The professor's optical sensors stopped twitching and focused on Marcus with laser-like intensity. I beg your pardon? Well, you're trying to calculate the probability of everything happening at once, right? But everything is always happening at once. That's sort of the point of everything. So the probability is just one. Everything that can happen does happen. We just happen to be experiencing this particular happening right now. Marcus gestured vaguely at the lecture hall. Like, the probability that I'm standing here solving this problem is 1, because I am standing here solving this problem. The probability that you're a professor is 1, because you are a professor. The probability that everyone in this room is confused is 1, because... He looked around at the sea of bewildered faces. Well, everyone in this room is clearly confused. But that's not... You can't just... Professor Kael-Vex began, then stopped. Because mathematically, the human was correct. Again. The most complex problem in theoretical physics could indeed be reduced to a simple statement. Things that happen have a probability of 1 because they happened. Right, so, anyway, Marcus continued. The real question isn't what's the probability of something happening, it's what's the probability of us noticing that it happened. And that's much easier to calculate because it just depends on how much attention we're paying. He manipulated the display again, and the entire infinite probability matrix collapsed into a simple equation that looked suspiciously like the mathematical expression for paying attention. The answer to that one is about 0.23, by the way. Humans are terrible at paying attention. I assume other species are better at it, but I wouldn't know. The silence that followed this statement was so profound that it achieved a sort of philosophical weight. Somewhere in the back of the lecture hall, a student's notebook slipped from nerveless appendages and hit the floor with a sound like academic dreams dying. Professor Kael-Vex looked at the simplified equation, looked at Marcus, looked at his life choices, and made a decision that would later be recorded in the annals of galactic educational history. Class dismissed, he announced. As the students filed out in various states of existential bewilderment, Marcus gathered his things and approached the podium. Professor, is everything okay? You look a little overwhelmed. Kael-Vex's optical sensors focused on the human with something approaching respect and fear. Mostly fear. Mr. Webb, he said carefully, what other subjects are you taking this semester? Oh, the usual. Advanced quantum philosophy, multidimensional art history, introduction to galactic politics. Nothing too challenging. Nothing too challenging, the professor repeated. Yeah, I wanted to keep my schedule light so I could focus on my thesis. Your thesis. I'm writing about the intersection of human poetry and universal mathematical constants. It's fascinating stuff, really. Did you know that the rhythm of iambic pentameter is actually based on the same mathematical principles that govern pulsar rotations? Professor Kael-Vex felt what he was beginning to suspect might be the early stages of a nervous breakdown. This human was going to be the end of education as they knew it. Well, he managed, I look forward to reading it. Thanks. I'll send you a copy when it's done. Fair warning, though, it's gotten a bit long. I'm up to about 12,000 pages so far. 12,000 pages on poetry and mathematics, written by someone who solved the infinite probability matrix as a casual warm-up exercise. I'm sure it will be illuminating, Professor Kael-Vex said weakly. Marcus smiled, that same polite, unremarkable smile. See you next class, Professor. Thanks for letting me take a crack at that problem. It was fun. Fun. As Marcus left the lecture hall, Professor Kael-Vex remained standing at the podium, staring at the simplified equation that had just revolutionized theoretical physics. In the margin of the holographic display, Marcus had somehow managed to leave a small doodle of what appeared to be a smiling tree. A tree that, upon closer inspection, looked suspiciously like it was winking. Professor Kael-Vex made a mental note to speak with the admissions department about their screening process for human students. Clearly, something had gone catastrophically wrong. Or, he thought as he looked at the elegant solution floating before him, perhaps something had gone exactly right. Either way, he was definitely going to need a drink. Several drinks. Possibly enough drinks to forget that everything he thought he knew about the universe had just been casually rearranged by a literature major who thought Shakespeare and quantum mechanics were basically the same thing. The worst part was, Marcus was probably right about that too. 3 days later, Professor Kael-Vex found himself in the most uncomfortable position of his 4-century academic career, sitting in Dean Morpheus IX's office, trying to explain why his advanced theoretical physics class had been suspended pending a full investigation by the Galactic Academic Standards Committee. Let me understand this correctly, Dean Morpheus IX said, her cybernetic voice modulators clicking with what sounded suspiciously like suppressed amusement. A first-year transfer student solved the infinite probability matrix in 10 minutes, then simplified it into basic attention theory. That is correct, Professor Kael-Vex admitted, his optical sensors dim with academic shame. And this student's background is in literature? Poetry, specifically, with a philosophy minor. Dean Morpheus IX leaned back in her chair, which made a series of mechanical whirring sounds. As a fully integrated AI biological hybrid from the Nexus Collective, she found human behavior patterns particularly fascinating from a data analysis perspective. Professor, in the past 72 hours, I have received 14 formal complaints from other faculty members. Apparently, your human student has been active in his other classes as well. Kael-Vex felt his equivalent of dread creeping up his spinal processing unit. What exactly has he done? Well, the dean consulted her holographic display. Yesterday, in Professor Quintal's Advanced Quantum Philosophy seminar, Mr. Webb apparently solved the question of universal purpose by suggesting that the universe exists because it would be rude not to. I beg your pardon. According to his reasoning, consciousness naturally leads to politeness, and since the universe is conscious, it exists out of courtesy to all the potential life forms that might want to exist someday. Professor Quintal has been in his meditation pod ever since, mumbling something about cosmic manners. Professor Kael-Vex's optical sensors began that familiar twitching pattern. What else? This morning, in Dr. Zara Nightshade's multidimensional art history class, he apparently proved that all art across every dimension and timeline is essentially the same piece of art, just viewed from different angles. He used finger paintings as examples. Finger paintings? Finger paintings. Dr. Nightshade is currently reconsidering her entire career. She sent in a request to transfer to the Department of Practical Basket Weaving. The dean continued scrolling through her files. Oh, and there's this incident from Introduction to Galactic Politics with Professor Vex Prime. Apparently, Mr. Webb suggested that all interstellar conflicts could be resolved by having the opposing species try to explain their positions using only interpretive dance. That's ridiculous, Kael-Vex protested. That's what Professor Vex Prime thought too, until Mr. Webb demonstrated by interpretive dancing the entire 3,000-year history of the Andromedan trade wars. Apparently, it was so accurate and emotionally compelling that Ambassador Crix fell from the Andromedian delegation, started crying, and immediately called for peace negotiations. Dean Morpheus 9's optical sensors focused on Professor Kael-Vex with laser precision. "Professor, I need to ask you directly, is this human some sort of super genius in disguise? Are we dealing with a galactic-level intellect that's pretending to be a simple literature student?" "I honestly don't know," Kael-Vex admitted. "He seems genuinely surprised when people tell him he's done something remarkable. Yesterday, I saw him spend 20 minutes trying to figure out how to open a juice container. A juice container. A standard twist-off cap. He kept pushing instead of turning." The dean processed this information with a kind of mechanical whirring that indicated deep computational analysis. "So we have a being who can casually solve millennium-old mathematical proofs but struggles with basic mechanical operations? That appears to be accurate." Before the dean could respond, her office door chimed. Without waiting for permission, Marcus Webb walked in, looking slightly out of breath and carrying what appeared to be a potted plant. "Oh, sorry," he said, noticing he'd interrupted something. "I was looking for the Botanical Studies Department. I think I took a wrong turn somewhere around the Department of Theoretical Sandwich Architecture." Dean Morpheus 9 stared at him. Professor Kael-Vex stared at him. The potted plant, if it had been capable of such things, would probably have stared at him too. "Mr. Webb," the dean said carefully, "what can we do for you?" "Well, I was trying to register for next semester's classes, but the computer system keeps crashing every time I submit my course selections. The IT department said it's some kind of logic cascade failure, whatever that means." Marcus held up a datapad that was making concerning sparking noises and displaying what looked like mathematical equations in 17 different languages, all of them screaming. "What courses were you trying to register for?" Professor Kael-Vex asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "Oh, just some basics. Advanced temporal mechanics, introductory universe design, philosophy of existence, creative writing for beginners, and underwater basket weaving. You know, a well-rounded education." Dean Morpheus 9's processing systems made a sound like a computer trying to divide by zero. "Mr. Webb, advanced temporal mechanics is restricted to final-year doctoral, candidates who have passed at least 12 prerequisite courses." "Really? The description just said study of time stuff. I figured it was like, learning about clocks and calendars and why Tuesdays feel longer than other days." "And universe design?" Professor Kael-Vex asked weakly. "I thought that sounded interesting. I've always wondered how you'd go about making a better universe. Like, this one's pretty good, but the whole entropy thing seems like a design flaw, doesn't it? Also, why is gravity always pulling down? Seems kind of one-dimensional." The dean and professor exchanged glances. Well, the dean's optical sensors and the professor's optical sensors performed what would have been a meaningful look if either of them had possessed traditional facial features. "Mr. Webb," Dean Morpheus 9 said, "perhaps we could discuss your academic goals. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish during your time at the university?" Marcus brightened considerably. "Oh, that's easy. I want to write the definitive comparative analysis of humor across all known species and dimensions. I figure if I can understand what makes different beings laugh, I can probably figure out some pretty fundamental stuff about consciousness and reality, and maybe solve a few universal problems along the way." "Solve universal problems with humor?" Professor Kael-Vex asked. "Sure. I mean, most problems exist because people take them too seriously, right? Like the whole heat death of the universe thing. That's only a problem if you're attached to the idea that universes should last forever. But maybe universes are supposed to end so new ones can begin. Maybe it's like cosmic crop rotation." The potted plant in Marcus's arms rustled slightly, as if agreeing with his assessment of cosmic agriculture. "Besides," Marcus continued, "I did some preliminary research, and I think I've figured out the basic mathematical framework for universal humor constants." "Wanna see?" Before either administrator could respond, Marcus had somehow produced a marker and begun writing equations on the dean's holographic display. The equations were unlike anything either of them had seen before. They seemed to dance and shimmer, almost as if they were laughing at themselves. See, humor is just pattern recognition plus surprise, divided by social context, multiplied by timing, Marcus explained, adding symbols that didn't exist in any known mathematical system. The reason different species find different things funny is because they recognize different patterns. But there's an underlying universal structure. He finished writing and stepped back. The equation hung in the air, somehow managing to look both incredibly complex and ridiculously simple at the same time. The really interesting part, Marcus continued, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just revolutionized comedy theory, is that if you solve for the humor constant in any given situation, you can predict the optimal response to basically any problem. Watch. He pointed at Professor Kael-Vex. You're stressed because you think I'm going to accidentally destroy education as we know it, right? That is not entirely inaccurate, the professor admitted. Marcus applied his equation to the situation, made some quick calculations, and grinned. The solution is to realize that education isn't something you can destroy. It's like water. It just changes shape depending on the container. You can't break learning. You can only break the boxes people try to put it in. He turned to Dean Morpheus 9. And you're worried, because the university's reputation might suffer if word gets out that a literature major is casually solving problems that are supposed to be impossible. That is also a concern, the dean admitted. Right, but reputation is just other people's opinions organized into a group. And groups are terrible at having opinions because they can't actually think. Only individuals can think. So the university's reputation is really just a bunch of individual people not thinking very well about what education should be. Marcus gestured at his equation. According to the math, the optimal response is to stop worrying about what people think about what you're doing and start paying attention to whether what you're doing is actually working. The silence that followed was different from the academic shell shock of the previous encounters. This time it felt more like the pause before revelation. Mr. Webb, Dean Morpheus 9 said slowly, what do you think education should be? Marcus considered this for a moment, absently watering the potted plant with what appeared to be a small emergency sprinkler system he'd somehow built into it. I think education should be like conversation, he said finally. Right now, it's more like a bunch of people standing in separate rooms shouting facts at the walls. But conversation is when people share ideas and build on them together. It's collaborative. It's fun. It makes everyone smarter instead of just making some people feel smart and other people feel stupid. He paused. Also, I think we should probably acknowledge that intelligence isn't really about knowing things. It's about noticing things. And the best way to notice things is to pay attention to them like they're interesting. Because everything actually is interesting if you look at it the right way. Professor Kael-Vex found himself experiencing something his species had never properly cataloged, but which felt suspiciously like hope mixed with existential vertigo. So, Marcus continued, instead of having classes where professors try to prove how smart they are by asking impossible questions, maybe we could have classes where everyone works together to figure out interesting questions, and instead of grading people on how well they memorize answers, we could celebrate the people who ask better questions. The dean's processing systems hummed quietly. And you believe this approach would be more effective? Well, it seems to work for me, Marcus said with that same polite shrug. I mean, I don't really know much about anything, but I'm pretty good at noticing when things don't make sense and asking why. And usually, when you ask why enough times, you either figure something out or you realize the question was silly to begin with. He gestured at the humor equation still floating in the air. Like, I don't actually know how to do mathematics, but I notice that problems are just questions that are afraid of their answers, so I try to make the questions less scary by being friendly to them. Being friendly to mathematical questions. Professor Kael-Vex was beginning to understand that his entire worldview had been fundamentally restructured by someone who approached the universe like it was a particularly interesting conversation partner. Mr. Webb, the dean said, I have a proposition for you. Okay? Instead of registering for classes, what would you say to teaching one? Marcus blinked. Teaching, but I don't know anything. Exactly, Dean Morpheus 9 said, her optical sensors gleaming with something that might have been mischief if she'd been programmed for such things. I want you to teach a course called Applied Curiosity, an introduction to noticing things. That sounds like a pretty long title for not knowing stuff. The course catalog needs specific titles, the dean explained. But you can run it however you want. No grades, no tests, no predetermined curriculum, just help students notice things. Professor Kael-Vex's optical sensors widened. Dean, are you certain this is wise? Professor, in 3 days, this student has revolutionized mathematics, philosophy, art history, and political science purely by accident. I'm curious to see what happens when he does it on purpose. Marcus looked down at his potted plant, which had somehow sprouted tiny flowers while they'd been talking. Can I bring Herbert? Herbert, the dean asked. My plant. I'm teaching him about photosynthesis, and he's teaching me about patience. It's been very educational for both of us. Dean Morpheus 9 processed this information and came to what could only be described as an executive decision. Herbert is welcome. Great, Marcus said, brightening. When do we start? Next week. I'll have the registrar send out announcements. As Marcus left the office, chatting quietly to Herbert about their upcoming teaching adventure, Professor Kael-Vex turned to the dean with something approaching panic. What have we done? Dean Morpheus 9's optical sensors followed Marcus down the hallway, where he had apparently stopped to help a confused-looking student who was trying to read a map upside down. I think, she said, we've just accidentally revolutionized education. And if we're wrong? The dean considered this. Through her office window, she could see Marcus patiently explaining to the lost student that maps were just suggestions anyway, and that the best way to find anything was to wander around until you discovered something more interesting than what you were originally looking for. If we're wrong, she said, at least it will be interesting. Professor Kael-Vex watched as Marcus's impromptu navigation lesson somehow turned into a small crowd of students, all of whom seemed to be having the kind of animated discussion that usually only happened in the faculty lounge after several drinks. You know what the truly terrifying part is, he said. What's that? I think he's right. About everything. Dean Morpheus 9's processing systems hummed with what might have been laughter. Professor, I think that's exactly what makes it so wonderful. As they watched, Marcus had somehow organized the small group of students into what appeared to be an interpretive dance exploration of campus navigation, with Herbert the plant serving as a sort of botanical compass. It was absurd, ridiculous, and completely contrary to every principle of serious academic instruction. It was also the most engaged and enthusiastic Professor Kael-Vex had ever seen students in his entire career. I suppose, he said slowly, I should probably audit his class. I think we all should, the dean replied. I have a feeling we're about to learn things we didn't know. Outside, Marcus Webb continued his accidental revolution, one friendly conversation at a time, while Herbert the plant quietly photosynthesized and pondered the curious nature of humans who treated the universe like it was their friend, which, as far as Marcus was concerned, it absolutely was.